Your mind and reality is a fraction of who you are. It's a fraction of what's transpiring. I'm going to misquote this, but Mike Tyson said it on the podcast that this is a very scary neighborhood and you're all alone. It's hard to realize that you are not your thoughts. I think this is so important in the world we live in today with the rise in depression, the rise of anxiety, the rise of suicide. We get so caught up in our minds. It's really hard not to. It's really hard to not live here. It's truly up to you to have your belief system and navigate through the world accordingly. You make the choice of how you want to move through life. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Vinny Brusco Show podcast. I hope you've been enjoying the show so far. If you have been, do me a favor, subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you get it, on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and right here on YouTube. You know the deal. Help me hack out of the matrix, please. Thank you very much.
And here we go.
I previously mentioned that during COVID, I kept what I called my universal purpose journal. And the reason behind it was just in case the grid went down, I took my Internet Explorer searches and put them all in a book. Concepts, theories, stories, people, all things that I'd like to pass along to my children that were thought-provoking, or at least that I found very interesting. And one of the things that I wrote down was a short story called The Egg by Andy Weir. And in the story, a guy dies in a car accident, and he's having a conversation with God in what is brought on as the afterlife. So the man dies, he goes to heaven or perceivably heaven, and he meets with God, and God has this conversation with him. And it starts off with the man asking what happened. And God goes on to say, and I highly recommend you go and check this out. Read the short story. I'll leave a link to it down below. And God says, you died. There was an accident. You died, and that's what happened. And the man says, is this heaven? Is this the afterlife? And God's like, yeah, kind of. And right away, the man says, what about my wife and my kids? Are they going to be okay? And God, kind of laughs it off. It's like, oh, so human of you. Your kids will be fine. They will mourn, but they'll move on. And your wife will secretly be relieved because your marriage was kind of falling apart anyway. But if it means anything to you, she'll feel guilty about it. But she'll mourn and everyone will get over it. And the conversation unfolds and they go on a walk, which perceivingly is through eternity and a blank, in my mind, a blank canvas of nothing. And they're having this dialogue, and God says, well, now you're going to go return. You're going to return to earth. And the man says, the Hindus were right. I'm being reincarnated. And God goes on to say, all religions are right. And the man is under the assumption that he's going to go back as the man he was before. And God lets him know that he's not going back as the man he was before. He lived 48 years on earth and learned the lessons he needed to learn within that 48 years. But he's in fact going back as a peasant Chinese girl in 540 AD. The man obviously very confused, like, you're sending me back in time? I don't understand. And God goes on to say, well, technically in your world, it would be back in time, but where I come from, there is no time. And he goes on to explain that he is from basically the world of gods, and there's multiple gods. And the man is one of them. The man was created by them. So the man says, I'm a god. God says, no, you're essentially a newborn. You're an infant. You're not even close to being that. But in order to go on to become a god, you must live the life of everyone who's ever lived. Now, I'm not saying that this is the way the universe works. I'm not saying that this is my belief system. But it's a very interesting point to think about. It offers a great opportunity to reflect on the decisions we make and how we navigate the world. So there's some bigger takeaways from this story, and I kind of listed them out, and I'll go through them. The first one is conversations with God. There's two ways you can communicate with God. I mean, I'm sure there's multiple ways, and people have their different ways of about it. But for me personally, my experience has been through prayer and meditation. Prayer for me, and I forgot where I heard this exact phrasing, but I think it hits it nail on the head. Prayer is you speaking to God, and meditation is God speaking to you. And there's always an opportunity for either one of those conversations. And I think those are important conversations to be having on as regular as a basis as you can. The second is that death is a natural thing. We have a really hard relationship with death, understandably so. It's the unknown, right? And anything unknown can be scary. It also has the opportunity and the potential to be great and amazing. But with the way our brains are built and the way that our ancestral history and the way we have fight or flight, the unknown lends itself to be a bit more scary. But we truly don't know what happens when we die. Now, I've been in sensory deprivation tanks where I'd like to think that, from my understanding of the experience, I experienced something very close to a death, floating through the void that I think these two were walking through, God and the man, walking through it, but floating through it and experiencing abundance and void, dancing with each other, feeling completely at peace. Nothing, nothingness, no name, no identity, just those two energetic states, the yin and the yang, light and dark, perfectly in harmony with each other, and feeling completely at bliss. A third takeaway is that we actually don't know what happens when we die, right? That relationship with death lends itself to not knowing what actually does happen. We're taught as young kids to have this imagination of, if you're from a Catholic descent or any Christianity belief, you go to heaven and everyone you know is there and everyone's having, like, it's this very childlike story that we're told to feel at peace about the unknown. And I think that's an important part of it, is to feel peace towards it, to feel that it's not something to be feared, but to know that it's natural. The man is kind of shocked that he dies, and God says, yeah, everybody dies. And that's the harsh truth. And that's what Stoic philosophers preached, right? Meditate on your death because it's going to happen. A fourth takeaway is something that I think is something that we could incorporate into our lives a bit more. I do my best to do it, but it's relationships are one of the most, if not the most important thing you could have in this life. The first thing the man asks God, what about my wife? What about my kids? The relationships that he had on earth are the first thing he asks God about, his concern. And I think that if we took more time and were more present and put down the devices and were more present with people when we were with them in their presence, then we'd be able to harness these relationships even further and deeper and have a more harmonious existence. The fifth takeaway is that all religions are right. And if you strip away the buildings and the prayers and the books and the writings and the humanistic interpretations and the manipulation, if you strip away all of that, all religions are right. The essence of the religions are the same. And in that regard, they're all right. They all essentially teach the same thing, which is the overall arc of the story. The sixth is that life is up to you, your interpretation of it, how you interface with it. It's all up to you. You make the choice of how you want to move through life. Is it predetermined? Is it predestination? Do you have free will? It's truly up to you to have your belief system and navigate through the world accordingly, but in alignment. The seventh is that there is a consciousness and a universal intelligence that's overseeing all of this, whether it be one God, a village of gods, gods with beards and whatever. There is something behind all of this. What do you want to call it? The force, source, universe, God. There is something orchestrating it. And it's okay to believe that. The eighth is that the mind is a fraction of who you are. I think this is so important in the world we live in today, with the rise in depression, the rise of anxiety, the rise of suicide. We get so caught up in our minds, and it's really hard not to. It's really hard to not live here. I'm going to misquote this, but Mike Tyson said it on a podcast, I believe, somewhere, that this is a very scary neighborhood and you're all alone. It's hard to realize that you are not your thoughts, but it is through those prayers and those meditations and those conversations with God that you're able to realize that you're not. But your mind and reality is a fraction of who you are. It's a fraction of what's transpiring. Number 9, which I think, again, is somewhat the arc of the story, is that everyone you victimize, you're victimizing yourself. Every act of kindness is an act of kindness towards yourself. Because the man has to go back down to earth and live the life of everyone who's ever lived in order to become God. The man asks him, so I'm Hitler. And God says, and the millions he killed. The man says, I'm Abraham Lincoln. And God says, and John Wilkes Booth. The man says to God, I'm Jesus. And God says, and the people he spoke to. The idea that we are all God, or we are all baby gods in the making. We are flawed. We are errored. We are imperfect. But we are gods nonetheless that are learning how to navigate the world and learning through each other how to be better, how to gain empathy. And when you could look, and when God recognizes God, when the God in one sees the God in the other, when the soul sees the soul, that's when true enlightenment, that's when true empathy can actually take place. Because without that empathy, we are dismissive of each other. We think this guy's an asshole. We think the lady behind the counter at the supermarket's a bitch. We dismiss what might be going on in someone's life, what they're showing up to the world in, how they're showing up in the world, why they're showing up in the world in this way. We dismiss entire backstory of who someone is and where they came from, and the reverse engineering of their lives and their parents' lives and their grandparents' lives and the ancestral trauma and experiences that have led them to be who they are, what they are, and where they are in that very moment. But if you're able to take that moment and recognize that that is God, then you are able to see the God within yourself. Because the man asked God, what is it all for? What is the meaning of all this? What's the purpose of life? And God says, I did it all for you. And the man responds, for mankind? He says, no, for you. This is all for you, so that you can learn all the lessons of everyone that's ever lived, so that you can become one of us. And the last takeaway from The Egg by Andy Weir is that the universe is an egg. The universe is this small, condensed pocket of existence that we get to engage in, and we get to be nourished in, and we get to learn our life lessons in order to take them to be better. Now, again, I'm not saying that this is how the world works. I'm not saying that this is what God is. I'm not saying that this is my belief system. But there is something that transpires throughout time. The Greeks and Stoic philosophy called it the eternal return, where universes were destroyed and reborn, and the same life was lived over and over again. So this idea of death and rebirth is an ongoing theme throughout time, different expressions of it, but goes on throughout time. But I highly recommend you go and read it. Think about it. Think about the 10 takeaways from this story. And it offers you an opportunity to reflect on your daily decisions. It offers you an opportunity to reflect on your relationships. It offers you an opportunity to think about those conversations with God, or what death may be like. It offers you an opportunity to see the person who's standing or sitting across from you as God. And if you could walk away from every interaction that way, I think we'd all be a little bit better off. That is it. Have a great one. Until next time, much love. Peace!